The moment Isabella Carter stepped off that train, she knew her carefully constructed dreams were about to shatter. But what she couldn't possibly imagine was that this humiliating rejection would set in motion a chain of events that would bring an entire town to its knees, and the man who spurned her would lose everything he held dear. Thomas Mitchell's face drained of all color as his eyes met hers. The bouquet in his trembling hands seemed to wilt before her very eyes. "You never mentioned," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "That I'm black," Isabella finished, her chin raised despite the crushing weight of disappointment. 6 months of passionate correspondence, weeks of anticipation, and a lifetime of savings, all crumbling in the span of a heartbeat. "In your letters, you seemed so refined, I thought." Thomas took a deliberate step backward, as if her very presence might contaminate him. The curious stares of bystanders in the small town of Millbrook began to gather like vultures sensing weakness. But here's where the story takes a turn that no one, especially Thomas Mitchell, could have seen coming. Because Isabella Carter wasn't just any woman seeking a fresh start. She carried with her a secret so explosive it would rewrite the very foundations of this seemingly peaceful town. "I can arrange your return ticket," Thomas muttered, fishing crumpled bills from his pocket like he was paying off a debt. "You seem educated enough to understand the complications." That's when a commanding voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Complications, Mitchell? Is that what we're calling basic human decency now?" The man who approached them moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Marcus Sterling, tall, weathered from years under the sun, yet carrying himself with an unmistakable air of authority. His simple clothes couldn't hide the obvious quality of the fabric, the kind of understated wealth that speaks louder than any flashy display. Thomas visibly shrank. "Sterling, this isn't your concern." "It becomes my concern when I watch a business partner of 15 years reveal himself to be a complete coward." Marcus turned to Isabella, his expression softening slightly. "Miss, I'm Marcus Sterling. I own the Sterling Ranch just outside town. I'd be honored to offer you accommodation while you decide your next steps." The offer hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Thomas's face went from pale to purple. "Sterling, you can't be serious. What will the town council say? What will the church ladies whisper?" Marcus's smile was cold as winter frost. "The same people who lease my land for their businesses. The same families whose livelihoods depend on my good graces. I'm curious to hear their opinions. And here's where you need to pay close attention, because what happened next would change everything. Not just for Isabella, but for every single person in Millbrook who thought they knew exactly how their world worked. The Sterling Ranch wasn't just a property. It was a sprawling empire. The grand Victorian mansion sat like a crown jewel among rolling hills, dotted with prize-winning cattle and thoroughbred horses. As their carriage wound through the ornate gates, Isabella felt a mixture of awe and wariness. Experience had taught her that kindness from strangers often came with hidden strings attached. Millbrook was founded by families who prefer their traditions carved in stone, Marcus explained as they approached the main house. Change terrifies them more than any natural disaster ever could. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, greeted Isabella with professional warmth. If she was surprised by the unexpected guest, her years of service had taught her discretion. "I've prepared the rose suite. It has the loveliest view of the gardens," she said, leading Isabella through the hallways lined with priceless artwork and antiques that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth. During dinner in the imposing dining room, Marcus shared his story. The son of northern industrialists who had moved south after the war. He'd inherited not just a fortune, but also progressive ideals that made him an outsider among Millbrook's traditional elite. "And your story, Miss Carter?" he asked, after describing his various business ventures that kept half the town employed. Isabella paused, her fork halfway to her lips. This was the moment. The crossroads where she could remain just another unfortunate woman seeking refuge, or reveal the truth that would shake Millbrook to its very core. But first, let me tell you what happened the very next morning, because Thomas Mitchell was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Isabella was in town, purchasing supplies at Henderson's general store, when Thomas burst through the door like a man possessed. "You need to leave," he hissed, his face flushed with righteous indignation. "Decent folks are talking. Your presence here is causing disruption." Isabella calmly placed her purchases on the counter. "I'm afraid that's impossible, Mr. Mitchell. You see, I've accepted a permanent position." Thomas's eyes widened in disbelief. "Position? What position? You don't know anyone here." "Actually, I do now. Mr. Sterling has graciously offered me the role of a state librarian. Apparently, generations of Sterlings have been collectors, but terrible organizers." Her voice remained perfectly level, but there was steel beneath the silk. Thomas turned to the store owner, Old Man Henderson, as if seeking an ally. "This is preposterous. She's what, Mitchell?" The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Wells, the town's only female physician and one of the few people who dared challenge the old guard. Educated, articulate, more qualified than half the men on your precious town council. But what Thomas Mitchell didn't realize, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that Isabella's new position gave her access to something far more valuable than dusty books. The Sterling Library contained the complete historical records of Millbrook, including documents that certain founding families would kill to keep buried. Stay with me, because what Isabella discovered in those musty archives would turn Thomas Mitchell's world upside down and inside out. 3 weeks later, Isabella had become a fixture in the Sterling Mansion's vast library. To casual observers, she was simply organizing centuries of accumulated literature. But her true purpose was far more explosive than anyone could imagine. Hidden among yellowed documents and faded legal papers, Isabella was methodically piecing together a puzzle that revealed Millbrook's darkest secret. The town's founding families, including the Mitchells, had built their empires on stolen land. The original deed belonged to her great-grandfather, Samuel Freeman, a freed slave who had been granted extensive territory by the territorial governor in 1867. But when racist violence forced him to flee in 1871, the white families had simply divided his property among themselves, creating what they called the Millbrook Development Trust. As Isabella photographed document after document, her hands trembling not with fear but with anticipation, she realized she held the power to destroy every prominent family in town. The question was, what would she do with it? Thomas Mitchell was about to find out. The emergency town meeting was called for a Thursday evening in October. The town hall overflowed with concerned citizens, their faces etched with worry and curiosity. At the center of the chaos stood Thomas Mitchell, gesticulating wildly as he addressed the crowd. "This has gone too far," he declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "Sterling is harboring that woman, and decent families are starting to ask questions about improprieties. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. These were people who valued tradition above all else, who saw change as a threat to their carefully ordered world. Then the doors opened. Marcus Sterling entered with the quiet confidence of a man who owned half the town. Behind him walked Isabella Carter, her bearing so regal that several people actually stepped aside to let her pass. The hall fell silent as death. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "Though I should clarify something important. Miss Carter isn't here as my guest tonight. She's here as the legal representative of a matter that concerns every single family in this room." Thomas laughed, but the sound was hollow, desperate. Legal representative? A black woman with no standing, no authority? Sterling, have you completely lost your mind? Isabella opened her leather briefcase with deliberate precision. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, I hold power of attorney as the sole living descendant of Samuel Freeman." The name hit the room like a physical blow. The older faces went ashen. Thomas stammered, That's impossible. Samuel Freeman is just a legend, a story to scare children." "Curious," Isabella replied, removing yellowed documents from her case, "because I have here the original land grant signed by Governor Hayes in 1867, deeding to Samuel Freeman, my great-grandfather, the territory that now comprises approximately 70% of Millbrook, including your hardware store, Mr. Mitchell." Judge Morrison adjusted his spectacles, examining the papers with growing alarm. "These appear authentic." "They're forgeries," Thomas shouted, but his voice shook like autumn leaves. Isabella continued, unperturbed. "The supporting records are all here, including testimony about how Samuel Freeman was forced to flee after attempted lynchings in 1871, and how the founding families subsequently carved up his land among themselves. This is where the story reaches its crescendo, so don't look away, because what happened next would echo through Millbrook for generations. Attorney James Crawford, the most respected legal mind in 3 counties, stood to address the assembly. The documents have been verified by the State Historical Commission. They are unquestionably authentic. Legal proceedings have been formally initiated. The hall erupted in chaos. Voices rose in panic, in anger, in desperate denial. Through it all, Thomas Mitchell stood frozen, watching his world crumble around him. Finally, he turned to Isabella, his face contorted with rage and fear. "You planned this from the beginning. This was always your scheme." Isabella's voice remained calm as still water. "No, Mr. Mitchell. When I stepped off that train, I was simply a lonely woman hoping to build a life with a man who claimed to value intelligence and character over appearance. It was your immediate rejection, based solely on my skin color, that opened my eyes to who you really are. The same kind of man who would have stood by while my great-grandfather was driven from land he legally owned. You're going to destroy us all," Thomas whispered, his face gray as ash. Isabella's response would become legend in Millbrook. "No, Mr. Mitchell. I'm going to correct a historical injustice in the most equitable way possible. The difference between us is that I've faced discrimination my entire life, yet I harbor no desire to see anyone homeless, not even you. But here's the twist that no one saw coming. Not even Marcus Sterling, who watched from the sidelines with growing admiration. Instead of demanding the return of all stolen property, Isabella proposed something revolutionary: the creation of the Freeman Community Foundation. Using funds from a legal settlement, the foundation would provide scholarships, affordable housing, and community development projects that would benefit every resident of Millbrook, regardless of race or social standing. As Thomas Mitchell slumped into a chair, defeated and broken, the town council voted unanimously to accept Isabella's proposal. They had no choice. The alternative was complete financial ruin for half the town's leading families. Marcus approached Isabella as the crowd dispersed, admiration evident in his gaze. "You could have taken everything," he said softly, "and become exactly like those who stole from my great-grandfather," she replied. "Justice isn't revenge, Marcus. It's restoration." 6 months later, Millbrook had been transformed beyond recognition. The Freeman Foundation had funded a new library, a community center, and scholarship programs that gave opportunities to children who had never dared to dream of college. Thomas Mitchell's former hardware store now housed the town's first integrated community center, where people of all backgrounds gathered for meetings, celebrations, and shared meals. Thomas himself had fled Millbrook weeks after the revelation, selling his remaining properties for pennies on the dollar and disappearing into obscurity. Rumors placed him working as a clerk in a distant city, his pride as diminished as his bank account. "You could have ruined him completely," Marcus observed one evening as they walked through gardens that had been opened to the public for community events. Isabella smiled, watching children of all colors playing together on lawns that had once been exclusively white territory. "Revenge would have satisfied me for a day. This," she gestured to the scene around them, "will satisfy us for generations." The story of Isabella Carter and the Freeman Foundation spread far beyond Millbrook, attracting historians and legal scholars interested in documenting similar cases of historical land theft. Isabella received invitations to speak at universities, sharing not just her personal journey, but the legal methodology she had used to reclaim justice for her family. During the dedication ceremony for the Freeman Sterling Community Center, named after Isabella's quiet marriage to the man who had stood by her from that first day, Judge Morrison offered a toast that brought tears to many eyes. "When Isabella arrived in our town," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we thought we knew exactly who she was, based on nothing more than the color of her skin. What a humbling lesson she taught us about the danger of such assumptions." At his side, Martha Collins, now principal of Millbrook's newly integrated school, nodded emphatically. "To think it all began with a cruel rejection at the train station." Marcus took Isabella's hand in his. "The best decision Thomas Mitchell ever made was rejecting you at that station," he murmured with a smile, "though I doubt he would agree." In the town square, where once only portraits of white founding fathers were displayed, a new bronze plaque told the story of Samuel Freeman and how his stolen land had finally been returned to its intended purpose, serving the entire community. As evening fell over the transformed town, Isabella stood on the porch of what was now called Freeman Sterling House, watching the lights of a community that had learned to embrace change rather than fear it. She had arrived as a rejected stranger, deemed unworthy of belonging. Now she was not just accepted, but revered. Not for conforming to others' expectations, but for standing firm in her principles and choosing grace over vengeance. When Marcus joined her with 2 cups of tea, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You know what's truly ironic," she said. "Thomas rejected me because he couldn't imagine sharing his life with someone who didn't fit his narrow worldview. In the end, that exact prejudice destroyed him, while you and this entire community thrived because you chose to embrace what he despised: strength, truth, and the courage to do what's right. The lesson of Millbrook would echo for generations. When we judge others based on superficial characteristics, we don't just deny their humanity. We blind ourselves to the extraordinary value they could bring to our lives. As Isabella Carter Sterling watched the moon rise over the town that had once rejected her, she knew that true victory had never been about punishing Thomas Mitchell. It was about building something so beautiful, just and enduring, that his rejection became nothing more than a footnote in the much larger story of redemption and transformation. And if you've stayed with us through this incredible journey of justice, dignity, and the power of choosing grace over revenge, you now understand why this story continues to inspire people around the world. It reminds us that our differences aren't obstacles to overcome. They're sources of strength that can transform entire communities when we have the courage to embrace them.